Henry, hello and welcome again to the New Economy Forum. Thank you for doing this. Our conversation today, I think I'm trying to structure it around two debates that we discussed earlier. One is how to prevent a war, which really is to do with China, and the other one is how to end a war, which is to do with Russia. You've just heard Wang Xishan talk about casting aside Cold War mentalities, and I thought that's a nice setup to our traditional metaphor. I think back in 2019, you talked about us being in the foothills of a Cold War. Then we advanced the next year to the high mountain passes. I'm not quite sure advance was the right word, but we went up. Last year, you described us as being on the edge of a precipice in terms of a Cold War. How do you see the situation today?
I'm more optimistic today than I was last time. If we use metaphors, I would say we are at the beginning of a bridge building effort, which is positive so long as we remember that if the bridge doesn't get built, the precipice remains. But the opportunity is greater now than it was in our previous meetings.
Is that reflected very strongly by what happened yesterday with Xi Jinping and Joe Biden? Because it's hard to believe that the rest of this year was optimistic. Was yesterday's meeting very important?
Well, of course, there can always be events that override statements made at public meetings or at meetings that become public. But I think a basis has been discussed today, such as the visit of the Secretary of State to China and the general statements that were made by both sides that permits us and in a way obliges us to start some concrete discussions on a variety of topics. What has been identified so far is the climate change and the overall global economic situation. That those are important topics, but they're not controversial in their objective. So in the months ahead, the two sides and others that may join them should focus on specific attempts to solve such issues as the South China Sea issue and the nature of specific methods of economic competitiveness. And down the road, how to limit the weapons that are now emerging, which combine artificial intelligence with enormous destructiveness. Those are challenging topics, and an open dialogue between the two sides would make a big contribution.
Do you see any historical...
to peace.
Sorry, Henry. Do you see any historical parallels in this? I mean, you've talked a bit about the run-up to the First World War. There were chances for England and Germany back then to have more constructive talks. Do you think that there is a sense that they were in a similar position?
Well, the historical parallels are not so hopeful. In For example, in 1912, there was great tension or potential tension between Britain and Germany. And there were two major British documents. One called the Roe Memorandum pointed out that Germany was a potential threat that had to be resisted on all fronts. The other one was a visit by the British War Minister to Germany, in which he proposed reduction of the German Navy in return for some modifications of British politics. As events developed, the confrontational course became the dominant course, and 4 years of war followed that those consequences went beyond anything any of the leaders had ever imagined. So if one looks at historical parallels, one should see what happened in that previous period, but as a result of deliberate choices made on all sides.
Isn't there a problem today, despite yesterday's meeting, that in general over the past year, the hawks have been proved correct? So if you're in China, you have seen America clamping down. You saw the Biden's sort of chip war, if you want, dividing the technological world into two. And from the American perspective, you saw Xi Jinping's re-coronation, Hu Jintao being shuttled off stage. That those are the things that hawks on both sides will see as you put it, the road to confrontation.
Well, there will be a concern that a conciliatory strategy is a way of reducing a society's capabilities and therefore its security. And that danger is inherent in the nature of diplomacy. At the same time, the two leaders that met recently will know that the consequences of economic disaster and of politic and of military impact on each other. So all we can say today is that a method for discussion has been agreed on and general statements have been made that are compatible with a cooperative world. But a long road still has to be undertaken, and thoughtful policies will have to be pursued, and frank discussions need to be taking place. But the door at least has been opened.
What about, Henry, what about the position of Singapore, or of countries in Southeast Asia? You know, this is, as you know, based in Singapore, where you've been before. You know, countries here were not terribly enthusiastic about Nancy Pelosi finally visiting the region and heading off to Taiwan. They did not see that as constructive. Do you think that this is, I suppose, the battlefield between the two sides?
But the countries of Southeast Asia have achieved substantial economic progress, and several of them great stability, mostly our host country. They want a peaceful, non-confrontational world. They are sympathetic to efforts to bring about solutions to challenging problems. They don't want a hegemonial country dominating their region, but they prefer to have the dialogue conducted rather than a confrontation carried out. And in that sense, the direction which I sketched before is one that, in my view, the countries of Southeast Asia and of particularly Singapore would welcome.
Can we look at the other conflict I talked about, Russia? I mean, yesterday we had Vladimir Zelensky, who we're going to talk to later, going to Kherson to celebrate the fact the Ukrainians conquered it. And there's a lot of talk in Europe about ending the war. Do you think that ending the war necessarily has to be the end of Vladimir Putin and the collapse of Russia? What does ending the war mean from your perspective?
Ending the war requires three attitudes. One, a decision by the key participants to end the conflict. Secondly, an agreement and a determination that Ukraine will emerge from the war as an independent country in substantially the borders that it had when the war started, and protected it by a close relationship with Europe. Thirdly, it requires Russia to look at the new situation, which is that the Russian capacity, which has frightened Europe at least since the Second World War, and some might say since the days of Napoleon, of a large conventional army marching into Europe and affecting the decisions within Europe, has been pretty well stopped and stymied for the future by this conflict. At the same time, one should attempt to bring Russia into the European system and into a relationship with Europe on the same basis as was done, or on a comparable basis as was done at the end of the Second World War with Germany. That requires a perception of a different structure of Europe and Asia in the future, in both Russia and in its current opponent. That should be the task of the peace diplomacy that takes place, that a Russia will be built into that system on the basis of equality and mutual respect, but with an end of the institutional threats that have characterized Russia's relationship to Europe, at least at key periods in the past century.
Do you think that necessarily means the end of Vladimir Putin, firstly? And secondly, what do you think is the consequences of Vladimir Putin going?
Well, there's no question that for some people, Vladimir Putin is an obstacle to this vision. I think that if he were to embrace this vision, the war should not be continued only for the purpose of overthrowing him.
Do you think he's capable of doing that? You've known him a long time. Surely that's beyond him. He's the man who started this conflict. He's the guy who's pushed this. He's the person calling up reservists. He can't embrace the sort of world you've just described.
think that the world now faces a big challenge of defining for itself what its objectives are, and not to be driven entirely or largely by the pressures of the moment. And the goals that I've outlined seem to me attainable. They will be more difficult in the case of Russia than in the case of China, because the basis of a conceptual dialogue has not yet been laid. And that should be the task for our leaders in the period ahead of us.
Can I ask you a little bit about, again, looking forward, about the balance of power in Europe? And particularly, actually, I was going to ask you about Germany that you just mentioned earlier, place of your birth. You look at Germany at the moment, it's paying an enormously high price in terms of energy and so on. But there are some people in Europe who say, look, in the longer term, Ukraine will have to be rebuilt. Germany is probably the country which will do that. And what has happened, and you alluded to it earlier, is that Europe has been stretched to the east. And that, I was in Madrid last week, the idea of a Europe which goes further to the east, that does have ramifications for the rest of Europe, and it perhaps makes Germany more powerful. Do you think that's possible?
Well, the process of economic development has made Germany inherently more powerful in every phase of the post-World War II period. And now it's in a situation in which it has the economic capability to contribute to the unification of Europe and to a peace with Russia that could be conceived either as a permanent enemy or as a possible friend. Within Germany, the problem has been that Germany has not had the continuity of political evolution that countries like Britain and France have had. It was unified late in the European evolution, only in 1871. And since then, it's been governed by an empire, by a republic, by a dictatorship, and now for the last decade in a democratic society. But for the young German generation, each new generation has implied a new discovery and a new debate about the significance of its previous leadership. So the direction which Germany will take will be decisive within Europe for the evolution that is possible. But I expect or hope that Germany will develop and that its present leadership will execute policies that lead to a merging of the possibilities that exist.
Your last book, as Mike pointed out, very good book, is about leadership, which I urge everyone to read here, if only for the chapter on Charles de Gaulle, who was both insufferable and inspiring. But I just wondered, you look at two last questions. First, if you look at Europe, especially, but for that matter, some people might include America as well, people complain about a dearth of leadership. Do you see any true leaders appearing? the kind of scale of what you were just describing in Europe and what you were previously describing here, do you see anybody who rises to the same level as the people who you profile in your book?
Yeah, the dominant leader has not yet revealed himself
or herself. I think we have to.
But one has to remember when de Gaulle arrived in England without money, without the language, after a total defeat of France, and proclaimed the greatness of France, he started from a much worse position than we are in today. So we are closer to our possibilities, but our domestic situations, the type of domestic debate that is encouraged by the modern technology makes it much more difficult for leaders to gain the leisure and the perspective to ask themselves where they're trying to go in addition and beyond what they're trying to do at any one moment.
That might give Rishi Sunak some hope that he's not in as bad a position as Charles de Gaulle. But can we end with one last person, which is one of the 6 people you profile is Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern Singapore, a friend of yours. Do you think he would be more worried by what is happening between China and the US or between the US and Russia?
I think he would be dominantly worried about a Chinese-American clash because he believed that the safety of the peoples of Asia would be jeopardized if the 2 greatest nations, to one of which he belonged by culture and the other one he recognized and respected on basis of its practical achievements, were to be contesting their special qualities.
Henry Kissinger, thank you very much. Today is the day where we were supposed to be reckoning with our problems. You've done a wonderful job for us yet again. Thank you, Henry, and we hope we see you soon.